So I'm gonna hop right in, and the first thing that I wanna talk about, I'm gonna get pretty nerdy here for a second. We're gonna go into some of the neurology, the neuroscience behind pornography addiction. Pornography activates the brain's dopamine reward system, which I'm sure you guys have heard before from other speakers. It's the same network involved in motivation, learning, and addiction. Each new sexual image or video triggers a surge of dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway. Whew. The nerves don't get any easier. This creates feelings of excitement and anticipation. Because online pornography offers novel with instant access experience, the brain experiences repeated high-intensity stimulation. Over time, this can lead to tolerance, sensitization, which means stronger craving responses to cues, and desensitization, which is a dulling of pleasure from ordinary intimacy. MRI studies have shown that individuals with compulsive pornography use actually display the same kind of brain activation patterns similar to people with substance use addictions. This confirms that the same neurobiological reward circuits are involved. Psychologically, this pattern often manifests as compulsive behavior, anxiety, depression, guilt, and emotional numbing. Individuals often feel trapped in a cycle of craving, acting out, and remorse. And over time, excessive pornography use can impair motivation, attention, and executive control, especially in younger users whose prefrontal cortex is still developing. Relationally, pornography fosters distorted sexual expectations, objectification, and emotional distance. This leads to things like secrecy, reduced marital satisfaction, and loss of trust between partners, especially when things escalate to things like adultery, right? And then this causes betrayal trauma in the partner. The person's capacity for genuine intimacy diminishes, and virtual stimulation replaces real emotional connection, which reinforces isolation and shame. So that's the nerdy part of this. I want to share 3 different techniques with you guys that help people who are suffering from the pornography addictions to help them through and overcome those addictions. Now, I blend faith and psychology with those techniques. The first one that I'm going to start with is heavily integrated with the Catholic faith, but I do have a side-by-side of the psychological equivalent to the faith-based technique. This is called the 4 R's of recovery. The first step in the 4 R's is to recognize the temptation. First R is recognize. The equivalent to that is mindful awareness. I'm sure most of you have heard the term mindfulness. Also, cognitive labeling. The moment you label the thought, such as, this is a temptation, you engage your prefrontal cortex and you shift from automatic to conscious processing. That awareness helps break the compulsion. Now, I'm going to dive deeper into each of these categories after I introduce each of these categories to you. The second category is reject. You're rejecting the disordered desire. This is cognitive diffusion or choice point. Saying, I don't have to act like this. I don't have to act on this. It separates yourself from the impulse. In therapy, we call this diffusion. It's not identifying with the thought. Your thoughts are not you. Oftentimes in therapy, we also talk about how your first thought, your impulsive thought, the initial thought is not defining of who you are, but more in line with how you were raised or the environment you grew up in. It's not necessarily your thought that is your first thought, but you can choose a second thought to put in place of that. And that second thought is more defining of who you're choosing to be. Number 3 is reframe and reverence the beauty. This is cognitive reappraisal and value redirection. You redirect the attention from objectification to appreciation. This rewires dopamine association from lust to gratitude, replacing shame with reverence. And then the last one is reconnecting with grace. The psychological equivalent to this is restorative practice, self-compassion, and accountability. This is things like engaging with prayer, confession, whether you're Catholic and you go to a priest or you go to a friend, right? And you confess your sins, or in this case, your problems, right? Your addictions and the struggles you're going through. AA actually uses that in their 12 steps. When you talk to your sponsor, you go through and you evaluate the hurt that you've put on other people through your actions and the impact that your actions have had on people. This is a form of confession, right? And then community support, which the AA model also uses, and I'm a big fan of. This reduces guilt and isolation and enhances oxytocin and social connection, which are the natural antidotes to addictive shame. So, recognizing the temptation, the first step. Awareness is that first step. You catch the thought at its onset before it takes root. The church teaches that temptation itself is not a sin, only consent to it. So recognizing the difference helps bring freedom. And this means noticing when a lustful image, fantasy, or thought enters your mind and labeling it for what it is. It's a temptation, not your identity. Emphasizing things like mindfulness and vigilance over your inner life, and noticing the first spark before it turns into a flame. Because that awareness allows freedom before consent. Rejecting the thought, rejecting the disordered desire. You're not entertaining it, right? Once you recognize it, refuse to dialogue with it. Because once you dialogue with it, you're giving that thought more power over you than it needs to have. And science also shows and backs this up that when you try to force yourself not to think about something, it's much harder to stop thinking about it, right? So we're not repressing the thought, but we are redirecting it. You're actively choosing not to feed or dwell on the image, fantasy, or desire. St. Thomas Aquinas says that the will can consent or withdraw, that what he says is sin does not lie in the feeling, but in the consent. So to take this to a psychological perspective, you do not have to engage with the thought. Acknowledge that it's there, and then you can wave goodbye to it. And you can even say things to yourself like, I'm rejecting any use of this person for my pleasure, right? So you're removing that temptation. The third step is redirecting the energy towards virtue, right? Reframing the reverence and the beauty. Chastity is not the absence of passion, but the integration of desire into love's proper order. Lustful impulses can be transformed into zeal for goodness, creativity, or, if you're inclined to it, prayer. And this redirection can involve saying a prayer for the person who is involved in the lustful thoughts, or doing something active if you're not a religious person. Doing something active like exercising or calling a friend. The virtue of temperance channels energy instead of suppressing it. So you're reordering rather than denying desire. You're reordering it. See, we as human beings, we see beauty in other people. And sometimes that ordered love for other people can become disordered. And that disorder can lead to lustful thoughts and that curiosity. And then the curiosity to pornography leads to addiction because of what it does in the brain, right? So this reorders it. And then reconnecting with grace, that last step. This strengthens the will and helps kind of clean out your heart. Now, the church teaches this isn't self-achieved, that it's the fruit of God's grace, right? But there are lots of things that you as an individual can do, whether you're religious or not, to help enact this step. Talking to a friend, right? Or a loved one who is a safe person to talk to, and telling them what's on your mind and what you're struggling with. You can make a quick spiritual act, and if you don't want to do that, you can make quick factual statements. Purify my heart. Asking whoever it is you pray to, right? And then there's an optional fifth habit that can sometimes be added, and this is recommit daily. This is important because sometimes when we struggle with addiction, no matter what it is, we fall off the bandwagon, right? I'm sure you guys have heard that saying before. Get back on the bandwagon. Fall off. With addiction, it's important to remember that sometimes there are going to be slip-ups. You're going to have an urge that took you by surprise, right? But that's not failure in recovery. You can still come back from it. You can still choose to recommit to your sobriety. Addiction tends to twist the truth. Ordered thinking of natural attraction and desire gets twisted into greed, lust, and envy, turning natural attraction and appreciation of beauty into lustful, disordered desire to take. So instead of repressing thoughts, which makes it harder to stop thinking about, like I mentioned, redirecting thoughts towards praise and kindness rather than glory to self is where the healing of ordered thinking begins. When you reframe beauty as something to bless and not possess, the brain's dopamine reward pattern shifts. You're pairing the visual trigger with gratitude and reverence instead of lust and fantasy, rewiring the association over time. In CBT terms, it's counter-conditioning. In spiritual terms, it's redeeming desire. So, one of the next techniques that I want to share with you, I'm actually going to make you guys do stuff. I want you to think of an urge. This is called urge surfing. I want you to think of an urge. It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual. if that triggers you. Any habit or craving that pulls at you, checking your phone, overeating, losing your temper. These are all things that we all struggle with constantly, right? Now, instead of pushing away, I want you to take a moment and think about it. And pause. And while you're thinking about it, I want you to take a breath in for 4 counts. Hold your breath for 4 counts. And exhale for 6 counts. I want you to imagine that urge like an ocean wave. You're not the wave, you're the surfer. I want you to imagine yourself riding that wave. Feel it rise in your body, maybe tension in your chest, maybe a quickening heartbeat. Rate its strength in your mind from 0 to 10. And just notice it cresting. But then what do waves do? They fall. So you can notice it now falling, crashing, and dissipating against the shore. Most urges peak and fade within 2 to 5 minutes if we do not feed them. The goal isn't to make it disappear. Sometimes it's extremely difficult to get rid of those first impulsive thoughts we have. The goal is to learn that you can outlast it without acting on it. Because you can. It's just a thought. Why this works. Neurologically, this builds something called distress tolerance. The ability to observe craving without impulsively reacting. In CBT, this retrains the prefrontal cortex to stay engaged rather than letting the reward system take over. And spiritually, it mirrors temperance, mastering desire through awareness and self-governance rather than suppression. Somehow I got out of order up here. There we go. The third thing I wanted to teach you guys as a technique to take with you is called implementation intention planning. It's an if-then plan. So it's a preloaded decision. Basically, you're making a specific plan for when temptation hits. In therapy, sometimes we use this like a safety plan, right? The urge hits, and we've already discussed, okay, what are you going to do now? What are you going to do when you notice it, right? So this is a preloaded decision, something you've already decided you're going to do. So now I want you to take a moment and finish this sentence for yourselves. If I notice myself getting triggered with whatever your addiction is, if I find myself getting triggered, then I will blank. For one of my clients, it's exercise. He will just do a bunch of push-ups. That's his coping skill for when he gets triggered. I have another client who will call their mom, right? So these are things that you can do when you get triggered. I have another client who prays. What works for you is what's important in overcoming those triggers. So you're deciding ahead of time so your brain doesn't try to negotiate with you in the moment, because people with addictions, their brains love to negotiate with them. Their brains love to try and tell them, well, it's just this once. Well, it's not going to hurt this time. It'll be okay, it's just a little bit, right? Maybe it's not so bad as I keep telling myself it is. Right? The brain loves to negotiate, so you're taking that negotiation off the table. Research shows that these if-then statements create automatic behavioral scripts It reduces the cognitive load, the mental load, when the urge arises. A couple more big words for you. They activate the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which strengthens executive control. And spiritually, this parallels the virtue of prudence, choosing the good in advance rather than reacting impulsively. Does anybody have questions about what I've talked about so far? I gave you guys a lot of information all at once. No questions? Yes?
Stephen, I forget his first name. Hi. Jonathan Knight, writing in The Anxious Generations. And he's writing as atheist. He's not a religious person. He writes that in his experience in counseling and as an educator and a psychologist, that he encourages people to experience the awe of nature itself.
That is a really good thing to fall back on. Yes, absolutely. If you are not a religiously inclined person, experiencing that awe in other ways, like nature, is a really good way to deal with that. In AA, they talk about a higher power, but as it's become more secular over the years, because it did start out as a more Christian organization, as it's become more secular, they tell people like any higher power. I know my husband had a friend in AA one time who used a doorknob because he was very non-religious, right? And that doorknob into the AA building was his higher power that allowed him to go in, right? So finding something that works for you is very important. It doesn't have to be cookie cutter. Everybody has the same idea of what that is. I, personally, as a Catholic, believe in the Catholic God, right? But that doesn't mean that you do, and it doesn't mean that that's the model that you're going to use, right? So finding some kind of higher power to help you through addiction is extremely important. Putting your morality, putting your faith in something bigger than yourself. Because when you look at a human being and your brain goes, wow, they're beautiful. In my mind, you're appreciating God's beauty that He created, right? And regardless of what you believe in, you can still appreciate that beauty without it becoming greedy. I want that. Or covetous. I wish I had that. Or jealous. I wish they didn't have that. I want it. Right? Because those are the patterns that we fall into when we don't experience something outside of our own desires. And whether that's putting faith in other people, putting faith in God, putting faith in nature, there has to be something bigger than ourselves to help us through what we're struggling with, because internally we're disordered. So we need something bigger than us to help us out of it, right? Any other questions about that? I've got 20 minutes. Cool. When it comes to, I'm going off script now. This is exciting. When it comes to pornography addiction, some of the things that start to happen are things like impotence, right? You could be happily married for years and years and years and not quite understand why every time you have relations with your wife, you cannot finish unless you masturbate. Why? It's because of impotence. It's because of that porn addiction. It creates an extra need for more sexual stimulus. If you attempt, if you're struggling with it right now, if you attempt just 1 week, no porn, no masturbation, and at the end of the week, and abstinence as well, and at the end of the week, you have relations with your spouse, I think you will be surprised at how much better it feels when you're not constantly getting stimulus from other sources, yourself, images on a screen, images in a book, whatever. Sorry, baby brain. So, again, when you're struggling with these addictions, wow, my brain totally stopped. I am so sorry. Yes. Yes, I would be happy to. Recognize, reject, reframe, and reconnect. Yes.
What are the 4 things in psychology that matter?
Yes. Mindful awareness, cognitive diffusion. Yes. Cognitive reappraisal. And then self-compassion and accountability. Yes.
Maybe try to talk about hypofrontality, just kind of hypofrontality.
Frontality.
Just from my own research on overcoming pornography addiction, hypofrontality is where the frontal cortex is overpowered by the reward center. So even if you have thoughts of, I should stop doing this, I should, stop this in the future, the reward center is overpowering it. So how can you overcome this phenomenon where you're thinking I should stop this, but in reality, the reward center is taking control?
Excellent question. Okay, so this is also really common with ADHD too, because there is some disconnects and the dopamine system struggles, right? So you replace the reward system, you replace the reward temporarily until you can move past that specific urge, right? So one of my clients, he has to work on a computer, okay? And this is a trigger point for him. He gets bored, he starts looking around, and he ends up on pornography, right? So one of the things that we talked about was replacing that reward system. So instead of going to pornography, he pulls up an old game like Pong or Snake, and he plays that on his computer. Because video games also create that dopamine reward system, right? So this is a temporary distraction. You can do healthier things. I think the keynote speaker talked about running, right? So you can do exercise. You can replace that reward system that's already struggling with dopamine to something a little healthier, maybe not as bad, right? Until you've got a better control of it. And you start weaning yourself off of that thing then, right? So with any substance, sometimes you cannot cold turkey because of whatever is going on chemically in the brain. In this case, with the dopamine system, when your dopamine dips, you feel depressed, you feel anxious, you feel totally lack of motivation, isolated, And it's almost like this itch in your brain, like, oh my gosh, I have to do something. Something has to change. I am so uncomfortable right now, right? That's when your dopamine dips. So you can temporarily replace it with something else until you can wean off of that and start. Let's say you pull out your phone and you play one of those mindless games, right? And that is your way of overcoming pulling out your phone and going to a pornography website, okay? So you're replacing the dopamine, and then you can start doing that less and less. Maybe find a game that is not fun, one that you don't actually enjoy. That way it becomes a chore to pull it out. Like, I don't want to play that, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
They're starting, this time, this is the question.
Okay.
Okay, a friend of mine, all his life, comes home from work. He's got, tons of stuff to do at home. And instead of, getting to the work, just lays down his work and sits in front of the TV as a complicated. Oh, I've got to catch the news. I've got to keep up with what's going on in the world. And that's the excuse for people stuff. The passive addiction.
Passive addiction, yes. So what was the question? I'm sorry.
So the question is, how would a person overcome the compulsion to, withdraw
From people and
completing
stuff.
the work rather than, taking refuge in just mindless,
Sure.
being manipulated by someone?
Right. And part of that is dissociating from reality. You're temporarily removing yourself from reality for whatever reason, right? And I would say that depending on the underlying reasons that your friend is going to that would determine the method we would use to help to get him to stop, right? Because if the reason is because he's been so overwhelmed all day that all his senses are like, I need a break. I need to shut this off, right? Then instead of methods for addiction, we would take a different approach, right? Maybe he needs a quiet space where it's just his space. It's clean. There's no clutter, because that can overwhelm the senses as well. And he can just take a minute to sit in kind of a sensory deprivation with some headphones on or something. So depending on the reason, right? If it's an addiction problem, if he's addicted to the screen, then that would be a different conversation. Then we go to, okay, maybe when he gets home from work, does he live alone, or is he married, or? Married. Okay, so maybe get his wife involved, right? So he comes home from work, and instead of going directly to the couch, maybe they have a plan in place. Like, okay, so when you get home, we're going to do this first together. Maybe she hides the remote. Something to help break that cycle, because the cycle is the part we need to break first, right? And it's going to be upsetting at first. And it's going to be uncomfortable at first. If it's an addiction to the screen that's the problem, it's going to be uncomfortable. And there's going to be days in the first few days of not watching TV and ignoring his family that he gets really angry. And maybe he says some unkind things because he really wants to know where the remote is, right? And he's desperate to get it. But making sure that the family is aware of how they're going to work together for it. It's a cooperative. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
I'm just curious, in your experience, so you laid out the 4 R's as a spiritual path.
Yes.
And as a kind of psychological path.
Yes.
In your experience, people taking those 2 different paths, what is the most success found? Maybe also in relation to sobriety versus recovery.
So that's an interesting one. I work at an evangelical Christian counseling center called the Christian Counseling Centers of Utah. So most of my clients are believing in some aspect. But I have had clients who are there because my boss is a trauma specialist and they are not religious, right? And what I have found is when you take the spiritual path, I see people recovering quicker that way. It doesn't mean you can't recover without the spiritual path, but I see it quicker. I take the approach of blending the two because they go hand in hand, in my opinion. They complement each other, right? Recognizing temptation is exactly the same thing as mindfulness, awareness, and cognitive labeling. So they go hand in hand, right? But when we believe in something outside of ourselves, it can help us overcome parts of ourselves that we don't think we can overcome. Yes?
What are some ways that you teach people to build their stress tolerance outside of the belief?
Yes. Okay, so distress tolerance. Observing the craving without impulsively reacting. One of the things that my boss, Dr. Praman, teaches, and I don't do this in my practice, but I do use some of the techniques, but I don't fully do it, is called psychodrama. And this is a really good way to help build that distress tolerance, using visualization exercises, acting things out if you're in a group setting with other people, if it's individual therapy, with the therapist or an invisible person sitting in the chair next to you, right? And having dialogue with that. You can take a feeling or take the urge and personify it and put it in the chair next to you and have dialogue with it, right? And this helps to separate you from the craving, from the urge, so that you're separating your identity from it, but also helps you build that distress tolerance because of that dialogue. You're directly, You're directly confronting it. Yes. You're directly confronting it, right? So that helps build that distress tolerance. And one thing I do in practice is the practice of sitting with feelings. Now, a lot of my trauma clients, we work on identifying in your body where you feel something, putting a name to it, what you're feeling, right? And then sitting with that feeling, not letting it take you down the rabbit hole of thought, but just sitting with it, acknowledging that it's there. Our feelings give us information about the world around us. And sometimes those can be, I don't want to say the word broken, but they can, I'll use the word broken for now. They can, maladaptive is the word I was looking for. Instead of being adaptive, they can become maladaptive, right? So something that's normally a good thing to notice becomes not good. One of the examples that I've learned about this is from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. She's a pediatrician in California. I think she became the Surgeon General in California after a while, but she wrote a book called The Deepest Well, and she talks about this. She says, our brains are wired to notice a bear in the woods and send a signal back going, there's a bear in the woods, do something, right? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. But when we're not in the woods and there is not a bear, sometimes that signal can be activated. And our brain is saying, there's a bear in the woods when there's no bear in the woods, right? And it's the same thing. Sometimes those become maladaptive. And you can use that and notice that with anything, not just anxiety, fear response, right? I hope that answered your question. I feel like I tangented for a second. Does anybody else have any questions? We've got 5 minutes left. Yes. Yes. That's important. So you can find them online too. Yeah. So she said that with her therapist, one thing she found really helpful is the feelings wheel. You can look this up online. If you go to a therapist, your therapist can print you out one. But it helps put names to feelings that maybe we don't always have the words for. And the particular client that I've referenced a few times, I've had to give him a feelings wheel as well. Because sometimes people just don't have the words, right? You know you're feeling uncomfortable, but you don't know what that feeling is called. Yes? Cool.
What's awesome about the wheel is you don't know what specific emotion you're feeling. It takes very broad emotions first on the wheel.
Yes.
I'm feeling angry. It gives you like 4 other emotions under that category. Yeah, don't want those ones. One more down.
Yes.
It helps you really define what you're actually feeling. And what's really awesome about it is it really helps you understand yourself. Because sometimes you say, well, I'm angry. Angry about what?
Yes.
Really angry, or is it something else?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And tying this back in with overcoming pornography addiction, right, is sometimes we're doing things and we don't really know where they started. Some of us can identify, I know that I was exposed to pornography when I was 6 years old and I haven't been able to stop since. Some people can identify that they became sexually active as a teenager and someone introduced it to them and, well, one thing led to another and here we are, right? Some people have the ability to identify where the points started of their addictions, but some people have no idea what happened. And somehow they just ended up, they're watching porn and they can't stop. So identifying what you're feeling and what maybe you were feeling when you're looking through your past experiences is a good way to help not only learn about yourself, but identify where those points were, where the addiction started, where maybe the mental state started that led to the addiction, whether it's escapism or loneliness, right? Whatever those points are, learning about yourself using things like the feelings wheel is very helpful to learning about yourself. And once you learn the points where that started, that is a really effective way of healing those hurts or healing those maybe trauma points that led you to where you are now, right? So thank you for that. And we are out of time. Thank you.